Experts thought it was just a wedding photo, until they noticed a dark secret. The century-old photograph arrived at the Philadelphia Museum of Social History on a cold November morning in 2024. Elena Rodriguez, a photographic archivist with 15 years of experience, carefully removed the image from its protective packaging in the museum's climate-controlled restoration laboratory. The photograph had been donated by an estate lawyer settling the Hendricks family collection, accompanied by minimal documentation, stating only that it depicted a wedding ceremony from 1912. Elena positioned the sepia-toned image under the museum's high-resolution digital scanner. The rain outside created a steady rhythm against the laboratory windows as she adjusted the equipment settings. What appeared before her was a formal wedding portrait, typical of the early 20th century. A bride and groom stood in an ornate Victorian parlor, their poses rigid and ceremonial as photographic conventions of the era demanded. The groom appeared to be in his early 40s, his hand resting possessively on the bride's shoulder. His expression conveyed authority and satisfaction. The bride, by contrast, seemed remarkably young, perhaps barely out of her teenage years. Her elaborate white dress and veil followed the fashion of wealthy Philadelphia families of that period. Her smile appeared practiced, carefully composed for the camera's long exposure time. Behind the couple hung a massive gilded mirror, its Baroque frame reflecting fragments of the parlor's opulent interior. The mirror's presence was common in formal portraits of that era, serving both as decorative element and symbol of wealth. Elena had seen hundreds of similar photographs during her career, yet something about this particular image created an unsettling feeling she couldn't immediately identify. She increased the scanner's resolution to its maximum setting, determined to capture every detail preserved in the aging photograph. The machine hummed quietly as it processed the image, translating more than a century of chemical deterioration into pristine digital data. Elena's workspace was cluttered with reference books on photographic techniques, historical fashion, and social customs of the early 1900s. She had learned that every detail in a period photograph told a story, from the cut of a dress to the arrangement of furniture in the background. As the progress bar on her computer screen slowly advanced, Elena made preliminary notes in her documentation journal. She recorded the photograph's physical condition, noting minor foxing around the edges and slight fading consistent with improper storage conditions over many decades. The image itself, however, remained remarkably clear, suggesting it had been kept away from direct light for most of its existence. Within minutes, she would discover why this clarity mattered more than she could have imagined. The digital scan completed after several minutes of processing. Elena leaned closer to her computer monitor, examining the high-resolution image with professional scrutiny. She began with standard assessment procedures, noting the photograph's technical qualities, the lighting techniques employed by the unknown photographer, the composition's formal elements. Everything appeared consistent with early 20th century portrait photography standards. Then Elena directed her attention to the mirror's reflection. At standard magnification, it showed only blurred shapes, the typical result of period cameras struggling to capture reflected images with clarity. But as she increased the digital zoom, applying modern enhancement algorithms to the century-old image, something extraordinary emerged from the mirror's surface. The bride's reflection told a completely different story from her frontal pose. Her carefully composed smile vanished entirely in the mirror's truth. Instead, her face showed unmistakable terror. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, her features frozen in an expression of genuine fear. The contrast between the two images was so profound that Elena immediately captured screenshots, comparing them side by side on her dual monitors. She zoomed further into the reflection, examining the bride's arms. What had appeared as graceful positioning in the direct photograph revealed something far more disturbing in the mirror's honest surface. Dark marks circled both of the young woman's wrists, clearly visible despite the photograph's age and sepia tones. They were too symmetrical, too defined to be photographic artifacts or mere shadows. Elena had seen similar marks in documentation of historical abuse cases. These looked like restraint injuries, recent enough to still show visible bruising on what should have been the happiest day of this young woman's life. Her professional training told her to remain objective, to consider alternative explanations. Perhaps the marks were shadows or damage to the photograph itself. or artifacts of the scanning process. But as she examined the image from every angle, adjusting contrast and brightness, the evidence remained consistent and undeniable. She spent the next hour documenting her discovery with meticulous precision, creating detailed enlargements of both perspectives. The laboratory's advanced imaging software allowed her to enhance details that would have remained invisible to anyone viewing the original photograph without digital assistance. By afternoon, Elena had compiled a comprehensive visual analysis that clearly demonstrated something terrible hidden in that gilded mirror's reflection for over a century. Elena spent the remainder of that day documenting her discovery with meticulous precision. She created detailed enlargements of both the frontal image and the mirror's reflection, noting every discrepancy between the two perspectives. The museum's imaging software allowed her to enhance contrast and clarity, revealing details that would have remained invisible to anyone viewing the original photograph without digital assistance. By evening, she had compiled a comprehensive visual analysis that clearly demonstrated the disturbing truth hidden in the mirror's reflection. The following morning, Elena contacted Dr. James Rivera, a research specialist in early 20th century social history at the University of Pennsylvania. Rivera had published extensively on marriage practices, immigration patterns, and family structures in industrial-era Philadelphia. If anyone could provide historical context for what this photograph revealed, it would be him. She emailed him the enhanced images along with a detailed explanation of her findings. Rivera responded within hours, his message conveying both fascination and concern. He arrived at the museum that same afternoon, his weathered leather briefcase filled with research materials. In the laboratory, Elena walked him through her analysis, showing him the stark differences between the bride's public face and her reflected terror. Rivera studied the images in silence for several long minutes, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This fits a pattern," Rivera finally said, his voice quiet but firm. In 1912, arranged marriages were still common in certain Philadelphia communities, particularly among wealthy families and recent immigrant populations. Young women, sometimes as young as 16 or 17, were essentially bartered between families for financial or social advantage. What we're seeing here might be documentation of a forced marriage. He paused, adjusting his glasses. The question is, who was she, and what happened to her after this photograph was taken? They spent the next 2 hours developing a research strategy. Rivera explained that identifying the individuals in the photograph would require cross-referencing multiple archival sources: marriage licenses, census records, property documents, and newspaper announcements from 1912. The Hendricks name provided their starting point, but Philadelphia's archives contained decades of accumulated records that would need systematic examination. Elena agreed to continue analyzing the photograph for any additional details that might aid identification, while Rivera would begin the archival research. They established a shared digital workspace for documenting their findings, understanding that this investigation might extend for weeks or even months. As Rivera departed, Elena returned to her computer screen, studying the young bride's terrified reflection, feeling an unexpected sense of responsibility to uncover her story. The investigation required access to historical records that had been gathering dust in Philadelphia's archives for over a century. Elena and Rivera began with the estate lawyer who had donated the photograph. Through careful questioning, they learned that the image had come from the Hendricks family estate, a prominent name in early 20th century Philadelphia's industrial sector. The family had made their fortune in textile manufacturing, employing thousands of immigrant workers in factories along the Delaware River. Rivera spent 3 days in the Philadelphia City Archives, combing through marriage licenses, property records, and society pages from 1912. The Hendricks name appeared frequently in business documents and occasional social announcements. Then, on the 4th day of searching, he found it, a brief marriage announcement in the Philadelphia Inquirer dated March 15, 1912. Mr. Robert Hendricks, age 43, to Miss Catherine Romano, age 19, united in matrimony at the Hendricks residence. Catherine Romano. Finally, the bride had a name. Rivera immediately began searching for additional records related to her. Birth certificates from that era proved difficult to locate, but immigration records provided crucial information. Catherine had arrived in Philadelphia in 1909 from southern Italy, part of the massive wave of European immigration that transformed American cities in the early 20th century. She had come with her parents and 3 younger siblings, all processed through Ellis Island before making their way to Philadelphia's growing Italian immigrant community. Elena, meanwhile, examined the Hendricks family's business records housed at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. What she discovered added a disturbing dimension to the marriage. The Romano family had worked in one of Robert Hendricks' textile factories. Catherine's father, Antonio Romano, had been employed there since shortly after the family's arrival in America. The marriage announcement made no mention of courtship or engagement, following instead the formal transactional language typical of arranged unions. The pieces were beginning to form a troubling picture of economic coercion and exploitation. Robert Hendricks had been a man of considerable power and wealth in 1912 Philadelphia. The Romano family, by contrast, had been among the city's most vulnerable residents, recent immigrants struggling to establish themselves in an unfamiliar country, dependent on factory work for survival. The 24-year age difference between Robert and Catherine, combined with the employer-employee relationship between their families, suggested a profoundly unequal power dynamic. The following week brought a breakthrough that would transform their understanding of Catherine's story. Elena received a call from Margaret Rossi, an elderly woman living in South Philadelphia, who had seen a newspaper article about the museum's investigation into the Hendricks photograph. Rossi explained that her grandmother had been Catherine Romano's younger sister, and that family stories about Catherine had been passed down through generations, though always spoken in hushed tones. Elena and Rivera visited Rossi's home on a gray afternoon, the narrow streets of South Philadelphia unchanged in their essential character since Catherine's time. Rossi, now 87 years old, served them coffee in her small but immaculately kept living room. Family photographs covered every surface, creating a visual archive of Italian-American life spanning more than a century. Among them, Rossi produced a small, faded photograph of 2 young women standing together, arms linked. One was unmistakably Catherine Romano, years before her wedding. "My grandmother Sophia talked about Catherine until the day she died," Rossi explained, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Catherine was beautiful, intelligent, and she wanted to be a teacher. She'd been attending night classes, learning English, studying literature. Then everything changed." Rossi's voice grew quieter. Mr. Hendricks came to their father one day. Antonio Romano owed money to the company store, debts that kept growing no matter how many hours he worked. Hendricks offered to forgive all debts if Catherine would marry him. Rivera leaned forward, his notebook open. "Did your grandmother say whether Catherine agreed to the marriage?" Rossi shook her head slowly. "She had no choice. Her father was desperate. The family faced eviction from their tenement. Her younger siblings would have gone hungry. Hendricks was a powerful man, and he wanted Catherine specifically. He'd seen her visiting the factory to bring her father lunch. She was 19 years old and was being sold to save her family from destitution. The testimony confirmed what Elena and Rivera had begun to suspect. This had not been a marriage in any meaningful sense, but a transaction dressed in the formal language of matrimony. Catherine had been sacrificed to protect her family, trapped by circumstances that left her no real choice. Rossi continued sharing details her grandmother had preserved. Catherine's tears on the morning of the wedding, her mother's grief, the elaborate dress that had arrived like a sentence rather than a gift. Sophia never forgave their father. Rossi added quietly. She understood why he did it, but she never forgave him, and she never stopped trying to help Catherine, even when it became dangerous to do so. Through Rossi's detailed family accounts, Elena and Rivera began to reconstruct the events of Catherine's wedding day. The ceremony had taken place not in a church, as would have been traditional for a Catholic Italian family, but in the Hendricks Mansion on Rittenhouse Square, one of Philadelphia's most exclusive addresses. The choice of location itself spoke volumes about the nature of the union. This was Hendricks's demonstration of ownership, not a celebration of partnership. According to family testimony passed down through generations, Catherine had spent the morning of her wedding in tears. Her mother and sisters had helped her dress, their own faces marked by grief rather than joy. The elaborate wedding gown, purchased by Hendricks himself, had arrived at the Romano family's cramped tenement 2 days earlier, a stark reminder of the economic chasm between the two families. Catherine had reportedly stared at the dress for hours, understanding it represented a cage rather than a celebration. The photographer, hired by Hendricks to document the occasion, had set up his equipment in the mansion's formal parlor. Large-format cameras of that era required several minutes of exposure time, demanding absolute stillness from subjects. Catherine had been positioned next to her new husband, his hand placed deliberately on her shoulder in a gesture that appeared protective in the photograph, but was experienced as possessive and controlling. She had been instructed to smile, to present the image of a happy bride for posterity. What the photographer couldn't have known, what no one could have anticipated, was that the massive gilded mirror behind the couple would capture a different truth. During those long minutes of required stillness, Catherine's carefully maintained facade had slipped in the mirror's reflection. The terror she felt, the bruises on her wrists from being physically restrained earlier that morning when she'd attempted to flee, all of it had been preserved in that reflected image. The mirror had become an unwitting witness, holding Catherine's silent testimony for over a century. Rossi explained that, according to family accounts, Catherine had indeed tried to escape that morning. She had climbed out a window of her family's tenement, intending to run, to disappear into the city's immigrant neighborhoods, where Hendricks might never find her. But her father and brothers, terrified of the consequences, had brought her back. The bruises on her wrists came from being held, from struggling against the inevitable. By the time the photographer arranged his subjects, Catherine had been broken enough to stand still and smile, but not broken enough to hide her true feelings from the mirror's honest reflection. Rivera's continued archival research revealed fragments of Catherine's life after the wedding, though official records remained frustratingly sparse. Women of that era, particularly immigrant women married to wealthy men, often disappeared from public documentation, their lives subsumed into their husbands' identities. However, several sources provided glimpses into Catherine's existence within the Hendricks mansion. Society pages from 1912 and 1913 occasionally mentioned Mrs. Robert Hendricks at charity events and social gatherings, always described in the most perfunctory terms. The articles noted her presence but never quoted her directly, never described her as anything more than an attractive accessory to her husband's social standing. Rivera found this silence itself significant. Women of the era who participated willingly in high society typically received more detailed coverage, their opinions and activities considered newsworthy. Catherine's near invisibility suggested isolation. More telling were household expense records Rivera discovered in the Hendricks estate papers. Throughout 1912 and 1913, regular payments appeared for medical services provided to the household. The frequency and amounts suggested treatment of ongoing injuries rather than routine care. Additionally, the records showed that Catherine received no personal allowance, no independent access to household funds. Every purchase, every expense flowed through her husband's direct control. This financial imprisonment was common in cases of domestic control during that period. Elena, meanwhile, located census records from 1920 that provided another crucial piece of information. The Hendricks household included not just Robert and Catherine, but also two young children, ages 6 and 5. Catherine had become a mother, likely within the first years of her marriage. This discovery added another layer to her situation. Whatever suffering she endured, she now had children to protect, adding complexity to any consideration of escape or resistance. Her cage had expanded to include 2 more lives dependent on her survival strategies. Through Rossi, they learned that Catherine's family had been allowed only minimal contact with her after the marriage. Sophia had managed occasional visits, always supervised, always brief. During these visits, Catherine would speak carefully, never directly acknowledging her situation, but communicating through subtle gestures and coded language. Sophia had noticed injuries, had seen Catherine's weight drop dangerously low, had witnessed the gradual dimming of her sister's once vibrant spirit. But in 1912 Philadelphia, a husband's authority over his wife was nearly absolute. Legal intervention remained virtually impossible without the husband's cooperation or clear evidence of life-threatening violence. The breakthrough in understanding Catherine's full story came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a colleague of Rivera's who specialized in progressive-era social reform movements, contacted him after hearing about the investigation. Foster had been researching Philadelphia's early social work organizations and had encountered something relevant in the archives of the Women's Protection Society, a now-defunct organization that had operated in Philadelphia from 1905 to 1925. The Society's records, preserved in boxes that hadn't been examined in decades, contained detailed case files documenting their interventions in situations of domestic abuse and exploitation. Among these files, Foster had found multiple entries related to Catherine Hendricks, née Romano. The documents revealed that between 1912 and 1914, neighbors and household staff had reported concerns about Catherine's welfare to the Society on at least 6 separate occasions. Each report described visible injuries, sounds of distress from the Hendricks residence, and Catherine's increasingly withdrawn demeanor. The Society had attempted intervention twice, sending representatives to speak with Catherine. The case notes from these visits painted a heartbreaking picture. During the first visit in late 1912, Catherine had insisted everything was fine, but the social worker noted visible bruising on subject's neck and arms, obvious fear in subject's eyes, speech patterns suggesting coaching or coercion. The second visit, in early 1913, never reached Catherine at all. Robert Hendricks had refused entry to his home, threatening legal action against the Society if they continued to slander his family. Most significantly, the files contained something extraordinary, a letter written by Catherine herself in late 1914, smuggled out of the Hendricks mansion by a sympathetic household servant. In carefully composed English, Catherine had described years of physical and psychological abuse, her complete isolation from her family and community, and her desperate fear for her children's safety. She had explicitly requested help escaping, providing details of her husband's patterns and vulnerabilities. The letter ended with a plea. "I do not know how much longer I can endure this imprisonment. My children deserve a life free from witnessing violence. I beg you to help us leave this house before something irreversible occurs. I am willing to face poverty, scandal, any consequence, if it means my children can grow up without fear." Elena read the letter with tears streaming down her face. Here, finally, was Catherine's own voice, preserved in ink on aging paper. The young woman in the wedding photograph, her terror captured in the mirror's reflection, had found the courage to ask for help. The question now became, had anyone answered that call? The Women's Protection Society's response to Catherine's letter marked a turning point in her story. According to the organization's detailed records, they coordinated with Catherine's sister Sophia and several members of Philadelphia's Italian immigrant community to plan an escape. The operation required weeks of careful preparation, gathering resources and establishing a safe location where Catherine and her children could hide beyond her husband's considerable reach and influence. On February 3, 1915, while Robert Hendricks attended a business meeting in New York, Catherine fled the mansion with her 2 children and a single suitcase. Sophia and 2 representatives from the Women's Protection Society met her 3 blocks from the house, where a covered wagon waited to transport them to a safe house operated by a sympathetic church in the Germantown neighborhood. The Society's records described Catherine as emaciated, bearing multiple recent injuries, but demonstrating remarkable courage and clarity of purpose. The escape triggered immediate and aggressive response from Robert Hendricks. He filed a warrant for Catherine's arrest on charges of abandonment and theft, claiming she had stolen jewelry and household items. He hired private investigators to locate her, offering substantial rewards for information. The Society's lawyers countered by filing for legal separation on Catherine's behalf, presenting documented evidence of sustained abuse. The resulting legal battle stretched over 8 months, with Philadelphia's newspapers covering the scandal extensively, though often framing it through the lens of class conflict rather than domestic violence. The case concluded in October 1915 when a judge granted Catherine legal separation and custody of her children, an unusual outcome for that era. Hendricks was ordered to provide financial support, but prohibited from contact with Catherine or the children. The victory was partial but significant. Catherine returned to South Philadelphia's Italian community, where she lived with her sister's family. She eventually found work as a seamstress, using skills learned in the textile factory where her father had worked. She never remarried, devoting herself to raising her children and, eventually, helping other immigrant women facing similar situations. According to family accounts, Catherine became quietly involved with the Women's Protection Society, offering advice and support to other women seeking escape from abusive marriages. She understood their fear, their isolation, their desperate need for practical help rather than judgment. Her own experience, terrible as it had been, gave her unique insight and credibility. Her children thrived under her care. Despite the financial challenges of single motherhood in early 20th century Philadelphia, Catherine ensured both received educations. Her daughter became a teacher, fulfilling the dream Catherine herself had abandoned. Her son became a successful businessman, eventually helping support his mother in her later years. In the months following their investigation's conclusion, Elena and Rivera worked to compile a comprehensive documentary record of Catherine's story. The photograph, with its hidden mirror revelation, became the centerpiece of a special exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Social History titled Reflected Truths: Hidden Stories in Historical Images. The exhibition opened in March 2025, exactly 113 years after Catherine's forced wedding. The exhibition attracted significant attention, not merely for its historical content, but for what it revealed about the power of photographic evidence and modern technology to recover silenced voices. Dozens of Catherine's descendants attended the opening, many meeting each other for the first time, brought together by their shared connection to a woman whose courage had echoed through generations. Margaret Rossi, now 88, stood before the enlarged photograph of her great-aunt, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the truth her family had always known, but never had proof to show the world. Rivera's subsequent research paper, published in the Journal of Social History, examined the broader context of forced marriages and economic coercion in early 20th century immigrant communities. Catherine's case, he argued, represented not an isolated tragedy but a widespread pattern of exploitation that historical records had largely obscured. The mirror in that wedding photograph had done what official documents failed to do: preserve evidence of a young woman's suffering and resistance. For Elena, the project transformed her understanding of her profession's significance. Every photograph in the museum's collection potentially contained hidden stories, voices calling across time, waiting for someone with the right tools and attention to finally hear them. She established a new digital restoration program specifically focused on examining historical images for evidence of previously unrecognized narratives, particularly those of marginalized and vulnerable individuals whose stories had been intentionally or inadvertently erased. Catherine Romano lived until 1962, dying at age 69 in the same South Philadelphia neighborhood where she had found refuge 47 years earlier. Her children and grandchildren thrived, building lives of education, opportunity, and dignity that Catherine's courage had made possible. The wedding photograph, with its terrible mirror revelation, stood now not just as evidence of her suffering, but as testament to her survival, her resistance, and her refusal to let Robert Hendricks's violence define her entire story. The mirror had kept her secret for more than a century, but now it told her truth to anyone willing to look closely enough to see it. In the photograph's reflection, frozen forever in that moment of terror, Catherine had left a message for the future: that she had existed, that she had suffered, that she had survived, and that her story mattered. The gilded mirror, meant to display wealth and status, had instead become a witness to injustice and, ultimately, to the power of one woman's determination to reclaim her life and protect her children from the violence that had defined her own forced marriage.